Hi, my name is Takashi Osaki.
And my name is Tina Kwan.
Today we are here to talk about adjustment process and how to close the inflationary gap. In the adjustment process, we explore the interaction between output gap and how the real GDP always finds its way back to potential output. However, before we explain the process, there are two key assumptions. One, factor price are adjustable. Two, technology and the factor supply are fixed. In the adjustment process, there are shocks between the aggregate supply and the aggregate demand curves that cause the economic input-output gaps. Next, Tina will talk about what happens when the economic is in an inflationary gap and how the adjustment process works.
Here we see the economy is an inflationary period. When the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve intersect, it creates a macroeconomic equilibrium where Y1 is. However, because the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve intersect past the potential output, it creates an inflationary gap. In this inflationary gap, production of goods have increased because there is a high demand of all factor inputs. This creates a shortage of labor because firms are producing a higher ratio of goods than normal. Workers will therefore have a higher bargaining power on their wages, and firms will want to keep up with the demand of goods, creating an upward pressure. In the adjustment process, the aggregate supply curve shifts to the left until the new aggregate supply curve intersects with the new aggregate demand curve at potential output where Y star is. This will close the output gap but also decreases real GDP. This shift is due to a rise of wages, and in order to cover the cost of the increase, the price level increases as well. Next, we'll discuss an expansionary aggregate demand shock. But in order for the shock to occur, we always start where the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve intersect, creating a macroeconomic equilibrium state. An expansionary aggregate demand shock occurs due to an increase in aggregate expenditure. For example, an increase in government spending, investments, consumption, or export. Another example would be a decrease in taxes or imports. This leads to an upward pressure on the aggregate demand curve, creating an inflationary gap. The new macroeconomic equilibrium state leads to an increase in wages, causing firms to increase unit costs. As unit costs have risen, the aggregate supply curve shifts to the left. This creates higher prices until the inflationary gap closes and the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve intersect at potential output. Next, Takashi will examine an expansionary aggregate supply shock.
Here we examine an expansionary aggregate supply shock. This is caused by oil price falling, which therefore shift the aggregate supply curve to the right, creating an inflationary gap. In an inflationary period, wage and the price level tend to rise. During the adjustment process, the aggregate supply curve shifts to the left until it intersects with the AD curve at the potential output. This will close the inflationary gaps. Tina and I would like to thank you everyone for watching our video on how the adjustment process closes the inflationary gap.